Texas, summer of 1945. The heat shimmered over the flat horizon, distorting the air above the long road leading to the internment camp gates. Dust swirled under the wheels of the military transport as it slowed. Its engine hummed in the silence. Inside, a group of German women sat in silence. Some were nurses who had served in field hospitals during the war's final, tragic months. Others were auxiliaries, clerks, or other staff. They all wore the same expression: clenched teeth, eyes fixed ahead, breath held as if awaiting the edge of a blade. Their hands trembled slightly, though they tried to hide it. Years of propaganda had taught them what awaited if captured: humiliation, mistreatment, punishment. They had been made to believe Americans were cruel and vengeful, that surrender meant violence or death. And now, as the truck stopped beside a barbed wire fence, guards motioned for them to disembark. A voice rang out calmly and firmly: "Proceed to the processing building." Inside, they were told what was needed: undress. The women exchanged glances. Fear grew silently in their hearts. And here's where the true story begins. By the time these women reached Texas, the war in Europe had entered its final, chaotic months. In early 1945, Germany was a country crumbling under pressure from all fronts. From the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly on Berlin, cutting through ruined cities and fields littered with destroyed tanks and scattered refugee columns. From the west, American, British, Canadian, and French troops crossed the Rhine and penetrated the heart of Germany. The Luftwaffe was virtually paralyzed, its fuel reserves depleted, and planes destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Communication lines had collapsed, the command structure had disintegrated, and the German state had become a mosaic of isolated pockets of resistance. In these circumstances, a large number of humanitarian workers were captured, not just frontline soldiers. Germany had mobilized an increasing number of women in the war's later years. Though they did not engage in combat operations in the Wehrmacht, they became indispensable to the war machine as nurses in Signal Corps, typists, anti-aircraft defense, and logistics. Many were members of the Wehrmacht auxiliaries, female auxiliaries assigned to military units in administrative or technical roles. Some were directly recruited, others volunteered, pressured by propaganda and national loyalty. Their lives were shaped by the atmosphere of total war and the belief that Germany's fate depended on every citizen's duty. With the collapse of the German front, these women were often close to combat zones. Field hospitals were overrun, communication centers captured, evacuation convoys scattered or forced to surrender. In many cases, groups of women were captured together, shocked, exhausted, and uncertain of their fate, which they considered crucial. Years of Nazi propaganda had portrayed the Allies, especially Americans, as degenerate and barbaric. Posters, films, and radio programs claimed surrender would lead to atrocities, particularly sexual violence or executions. Nazi leadership used this fear to maintain discipline, especially as defeat became inevitable. The messages were repeated endlessly in training rooms, newspapers, and whispered in barracks: "Do not fall into enemy hands." When surrender finally came, it was not a moment of relief. For many, it was terrifying. Faced with the massive number of prisoners, the U.S. Army began transporting them far from the European front. The United States housed nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war in camps across the country, from the Deep South to the Great Plains and the West Coast. The decision was pragmatic. These prisoners could be securely housed far from any front and used to alleviate wartime labor shortages in the home front. Texas became one of the key centers of this system. Its vast open landscape, warm climate, and existing military infrastructure made it ideal for large camps. These included Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Camp Mahia, and several processing facilities near Fort Sam Houston. Most housed troops and officers, but some processing centers also held female prisoners, especially medical and support staff captured overseas. The journey to the United States was long and disorienting. Prisoners were transported by truck and train to ports in France or Italy, then by ship across the Atlantic. Fear accompanied them the entire way. Rumors circulated. No one knew for certain what awaited. When the ships docked, they encountered something unexpected. No jeering crowds, no vengeful soldiers. The process was methodical, orderly, structured. The U.S. Army followed the 1929 Geneva Convention Protocol. The law required humane treatment of prisoners of war. Food, shelter, medical care, and dignity were not courtesies but obligations. But these women did not know this. When they arrived at the camps, they were tired, hungry, and emotionally drained. The military police who received them did not shout. They simply gave instructions. They were told to go to the medical intake room. There, they were informed, please remove your clothing for inspection, disinfection, and parasite removal, a standard measure mandatory for all prisoners, regardless of nationality, to prevent disease outbreaks. For many women, this sounded like the start of the nightmare they feared. But what followed would undermine every belief they had been indoctrinated with about the enemy. And this is where the deeper context begins. To understand what happened in these Texas processing facilities, we must grasp how the United States treated enemy prisoners of war during World War II. Unlike Germany, with its concentration camps and forced labor systems, the United States adhered strictly and deliberately to international law. The 1929 Geneva Convention was not just a legal matter. It was ideological, strategic, and practical. U.S. military high command believed the treatment of German prisoners directly impacted the treatment of American prisoners overseas. Reports already existed of harsh conditions in German camps, especially for captured airmen. Ensuring documented humane treatment in U.S. camps served two purposes: moral clarity in wartime and diplomatic leverage in negotiations over American POWs in Europe. Moreover, the U.S. economy was in full wartime mobilization. Millions of Americans served overseas. Agriculture, in particular, faced severe labor shortages. Consequently, German POWs were assigned structured work, often agricultural or maintenance, in exchange for modest wages paid in canteen scrip. This arrangement was legal, codified, and overseen by the International Red Cross. It also meant the government had no interest in weakening, mistreating, or starving its prisoners. Healthy POWs were a functional labor force. Before prisoners could work, live in barracks, or receive U.S. uniforms, they first had to be processed. And disease was the primary concern. When large groups of displaced people migrate across continents, especially in wartime, outbreaks of lice-borne diseases like typhus became a serious threat. Outbreaks had ravaged Eastern Europe and field hospitals at the front. The U.S. Army had seen the consequences of neglecting decontamination. Thus, upon arrival of each POW group, men and women alike, a standardized intake protocol was followed. Clothing removed, personal items cataloged, hair and body checked for lice, shower, and medical exam. Clothing and footwear were disinfected, replaced, or burned. For U.S. medical and logistical staff, this was routine. 4 German women arriving in Texas, it was anything but. Many came from field hospitals where they had tended wounded soldiers amid collapsing supply lines, retreating columns, artillery fire, and chaotic evacuations. Their uniforms were worn, their hands marked by labor, their nerves frayed after months of fear and flight. The idea of undressing before strangers, men in an enemy country thousands of miles from home, seemed synonymous with vulnerability, danger, and exposure. The intake rooms, however, were not makeshift intimidation sites. They were plain, well-lit, and efficiently organized. Examining staff were predominantly nurses and medical personnel specifically assigned to female POW care. Whenever possible, screens were set up for privacy. The tone of communication was professional, direct, objective. The women entering did not yet know this. They entered burdened by the weight of propaganda, warnings of assaults, cruelties, humiliations. Some tried to remain stoic, determined not to show fear. Others clung to their uniform hems, unsure whether to comply. And then something unexpected happened. The U.S. staff waited. They did not shout, did not touch clothing, simply repeated instructions calmly. Clothing in one pile, shoes in another. Step forward for inspection. No rashi, no treats, no agresión. The silence in the room began to shift. Fear did not intensify, it dispersed slowly. This was the first shocking moment. Not the act of undressing itself, but the absence of brutality. Because the women had been told who the enemy was supposed to be. And here, in an isolated building on the other side of the world, reality contradicted the myth. Once medical exams were complete, the women received clean clothing, soap, towels, and proper footwear. They were led to clean, intact barracks. Beds had mattresses, windows could open. Food was prepared to caloric and nutritional standards, ensuring health, not deprivation. Even more disorienting, guards addressed them with formality, not contempt. For the first time in many months, perhaps years, some of these women slept without distant artillery fire. Yet this was only the beginning of the transformation that would unfold in these camps. The emotional, psychological, and moral contrast between expectation and reality would soon reshape identities, loyalties, and beliefs. And this leads us to the deepest human dimension of the story. The story of these German women in Texas cannot be understood solely through historical logic. To grasp its full meaning, we must enter the world they carried in their minds upon entering these camps. Because the most significant change did not occur in the barracks or mess hall. It happened in the collapse of belief. Perspective 1. Fear and propaganda. For years, these women lived under a system rooted in psychological control. The Nazi state relied not just on obedience, but on constructing a worldview where Germany stood alone, surrounded by hostile forces. The outside world was portrayed as predatory, immoral, threatening. In this narrative, the United States was not merely a distant nation, but an existential enemy shaped into the embodiment of cruelty. This image was reinforced through recruitment speeches, radio broadcasts, school lessons, and internal military briefings. The enemy was not just someone opposing Germany. It was someone who hated Germany. This distinction shaped the concept of surrender not as negotiation, but as annihilation. When the war ended and these women were transported thousands of miles across the Atlantic, they did not expect to survive. They expected punishment. Many had mentally prepared for the worst. Their silence during transport was not resistance, but resignation. But once processed, housed, and fed, their inner world collided with a contradiction. And contradictions destabilize faith. Fear cannot take root if reality does not support it. But faith does not collapse overnight. It frays slowly. The initial shock was not relief. It was confusion. Confusion arises when the foundations of one's worldview begin to crumble. These women were not conventional soldiers. They had not stormed trenches or operated machine gun nests. Yet they were part of the German military system. Many had worn uniforms and insignia. They had sworn loyalty. They believed, at least for a time, that they were supporting national defense through medical care, duty, or sacrifice. But identity is fragile when stripped of its context. In Germany, their uniforms symbolized belonging, participation, purpose. In a Texas camp, those same uniforms identified them as prisoners. The same insignia that once proclaimed pride now marked them as defeated. This led to a subtle but profound internal shift. They were no longer actors in history. They had become witnesses to it. The war continued without them. Decisions were made far from home. The empire they had served was collapsing. They could no longer influence the outcome. All that remained was adaptation. Undressing during intake symbolized more than disinfection. It was the stripping of status. Yet what surprised many was that after status was removed, their humanity remained. They were not humiliated, not broken, not shamed. They were simply treated as human beings needing medical care, food, and shelter. This realization, however subtle, had a deeply personal and destabilizing effect. In interviews decades later, many former POWs described the moment they realized the Americans would not harm them. For some, it was the guards' tone of voice. For others, the taste of their first decent meal. For still others, the unexpected presence of books in the camp library. Yet one detail recurs in memoirs and oral traditions: the moment a U.S. nurse handed them a towel. It was not thrown. It was not tossed over a barrier. It was handed directly, as if to a patient. This gesture was small, almost routine, but small gestures carry greater weight when used to combat fear. The towel meant, "You are not prey. You are not property. We see you as a person." This marked the beginning of a slow, emotional thawing. But the story did not end there. As initial fear dissipated, another force emerged, something far more complex. These women had to reconcile two contradictory truths. They had served a regime demanding absolute loyalty, yet the enemy they feared treated them with dignity. Here began the true internal conflict. If the first change was emotional, the second was social. Camp life brought together people who had arrived with different experiences, loyalties, and expectations. And the environment in which they now lived shaped their interactions, both among themselves and with the Americans guarding them. The guards in these camps were not frontline veterans. Many were reservists, older soldiers, or military personnel medically unfit for overseas deployment. Some were only slightly older than the women they supervised. Others were decades older. Their role was logistical, not punitive. They received precise instructions: treat prisoners in accordance with the Geneva Convention, maintain discipline and order, avoid unnecessary force, prevent escape attempts, ensure the health of those in their charge. They were not taught to hate the prisoners. For some, the prisoners were simply part of the war's administrative apparatus. For others, the war felt distant, something happening elsewhere to other people. Their daily life was structured like a job: rotating shifts, patrols, paperwork, inventory. But the guards could not ignore the emotional atmosphere in the camp. They noticed the fear, hesitation, and silence of the women, especially in the early days. Some guards later recalled moments when prisoners avoided eye contact, kept their distance, or flinched when spoken to. Others remembered how things gradually changed. Questions were asked, brief conversations began. Short talks during meals or task assignments slowly turned into simple, cautious interactions. For the guards, the most surprising thing was not defiance or hostility. It was courtesy. One security guard wrote decades later, "They had lost everything, yet they maintained dignity. I didn't expect that." Human respect can be quiet but unmistakable. The cultural differences between rural Texas and wartime Germany were vast. Many German women came from cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Stuttgart, shaped by education, industry, and wartime mobilization. Texas, by contrast, was open country. Time moved slowly. The heat was intense. Dust was everywhere. The sound of cicadas and vast fields of wheat or cotton. Even the soundscape was unfamiliar. The absence of explosions was disorienting. No distant artillery. No sirens. No shelter. Silence can feel unreliable when one has lived in danger too long. The women were assigned structured labor: gardening, sewing, cleaning medical facilities, and farm work on nearby ranches. Sometimes they worked alongside locals, leading to something unexpected: conversation. At first, it was cautious. Americans spoke slowly. Germans responded thoughtfully. But then conversation flowed. And once language breaks through, barriers begin to crumble. When two people speak to each other, the concept of enemy becomes abstract. This gradual humanization was one of the camp's most powerful forces. Camp life followed a structured daily routine, and routine creates stability. Morning roll call at a set time, breakfast with measured rations, assigned work based on ability and health, free time, often outdoors, sometimes with access to sports equipment, library time with German books available, lights out, predictable and calm. This structure was radically different from the chaos they had left behind. It was not luxurious. POW camps were not designed for comfort, but it was consistency. And consistency has a psychological effect. It reduces anxiety, allows the mind to adapt, allows the body to recover. And with recovery came reflection. The women began to perceive the emotional gap between the world they had believed in and the world they now inhabited. Some clung desperately to their ideology and resisted any shift in thinking. Others, having experienced safety, adequate food, a structured daily routine, and respectful treatment for extended periods, began to question the narratives that had guided their lives. Over time, fragments of identity were reshaped. They were no longer simply Germans in service to the Reich. They were individuals adapting to their circumstances. And this slow development led the story to its decisive moment. The moment one remembers most clearly, the intake and disinfection process, the moment they feared most, and the moment that changed everything. Here is where the emotional climax unfolds. The camp's reception building was designed for efficiency, not emotional atmosphere. Its walls were smooth, floors concrete, lighting bright, but not harsh. A faint smell of soap and disinfectant hung in the air. Metal tables lined up neatly, each with labeled trays for clothing, brushes, medical instruments, towels, and forms. As the group of German women was escorted inside, their footsteps echoed softly. No one spoke. They had spent days listening to their own fears, and now they had arrived at the very moment those fears had concentrated. A U.S. nurse stepped forward. Her uniform was clean, her posture steady, her expression calm. She spoke through an interpreter in a quiet, professional voice. Instructions were clear: remove clothing. Shoes, personal items would be labeled and recorded. All women would receive a medical exam and lice treatment. New clothing would then be distributed. The tone was objective, not emotional. Yet the events carried a different meaning for the listeners. Removing the uniform meant more than shedding fabric. It was the loss of identity, belonging, and the last vestiges of control. For a moment, no one moved. It was the pause of fear, the hesitation before crossing a threshold with no return. Then one woman stepped forward, not because she was stronger than the others, but because prolonged silence becomes unbearable. She began unbuttoning her jacket. Slowly, the others followed. Uniforms came off, shoes placed in designated bins, personal items, watches, rings, small lockets of photos set aside. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared, seeking comfort in familiar eyes. The U.S. staff did not pressure them. Time was allotted. The first exam began. A nurse checked hair for lice. Another examined skin for rashes or wounds, posture, breathing, pulse, eyes. No invasive exams, no humiliations, completely unlike what the women had been led to believe. For many, confusion replaced fear. Next came the lice treatment. Fine DDT powder dusted along the hairline, underarms, and skin folds. It was a clinical, standardized treatment identical to what U.S. soldiers received in field hospitals. Then came showers, warm water, clean towels, no guards present. The women began to understand. This was not punishment. This was not degradation. This was medicine, prevention, health. And the realization hit like a silent lightning bolt. The enemy had no intent to harm them. The enemy protected them from disease, discomfort, the horrors of infestation. After processing, they received clean undergarments, simple work clothes or coveralls, sturdy socks, and used but serviceable shoes from the warehouse. The clothing was plain, uniform, unadorned. For the first time in months, they no longer wore garments marked by exhaustion, sweat, or fear. Some women sat on benches and cried, not loudly, but with the silent, trembling relief of a body that had held tension too long. They did not cry from shame. They cried because the danger they had prepared for did not materialize. The most memorable moments of war are not always loud. Sometimes they happen in silence, in a space where expectations collapse. A security guard near the entrance looked away, granting them privacy, not because he was ordered to, but because he understood that dignity is not proclaimed, it is recognized. As the group was escorted from the reception building to the barracks, the atmosphere had changed. The fear they had carried from the transport ship, train stations, battlefields, and evacuation routes across Europe began to recede. The Texas sky was vast, stretching infinitely across the plains. The heat was stifling, but the air smelled clean. The path to the barracks was lined with short grass and patches of sand. For the first time in many weeks, no one shouted orders, no one ran, no one fled. Their world had slowed. Not peace. Peace was still distant, uncertain, resolute. But silence. The silence in which a person can think again, feel again, remember who they were before fear became a permanent state. This was the turning point, not in war strategic sense, but in human perception. The moment the image of the enemy shattered, the moment they understood they had not been captured by monsters, but by humans. What happened in the days and weeks after intake was not dramatic. There were no confrontations, no cinematic revelations. The change was quieter and therefore deeper. After settling into barracks, the German women began following a regular daily routine. Routine is powerful. It replaces fear with familiarity. A whistle sounded each morning. Roll call. The sun rose slowly over the flat Texas horizon, bathing the sky in pale orange and faint gold. The air was cool in the dawn light before the heat arrived. The women lined up, names were checked, numbers recorded. But unlike the formations they knew from Germany, there were no shouts, no insults, no intimidation. Guards spoke in clear, calm voices. Discipline was expected, but not fear. Within days, the women noticed something else. They had freedom of movement within the camp. Fences were high, gates guarded, but the open space was theirs. They could walk, sit in the shade, talk, think. Time returned to them, not measured by artillery fire or evacuation orders, but by hours, daylight, and meals. Meals were served at regular intervals. Bread, stew, beans, potatoes, sometimes fruit. It was not luxury, but it was consistent and more abundant than what German civilians received behind collapsing front lines. This consistency had a profound effect. It told the body, you are safe. And when the body accepts safety, the mind begins to open. One of the most formative experiences came not from the camp itself, but from the opportunity to send and receive letters. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs were allowed to correspond with families. When the first letters from Germany arrived, they did not bring comfort, they brought reality. Bombed cities, missing relatives, shortages, and silence where loved ones' names should have been. The war they had left behind continued to rage. And when they replied, they reported something astonishing. They were well treated. They described beds, meals, work that did not harm the body, guards who followed rules, doctors who treated illnesses without questions or cost. These letters crossed the Atlantic and reached German homes already steeped in grief, confusion, and disbelief. And for the first time, the image of the enemy changed, not through ideology, but through lived experience. A mother in Hamburg who read her daughter's words about clean clothes and respectful behavior did not see the Americans she had been warned about. She saw fellow humans. This was a psychological turning point, not just for the women in Texas, but for the families they left behind. War shapes nations, but stories reshape memory. There were ideological divisions within the camp. Some women remained loyal to the Reich. Their loyalty not born of cruelty or power hunger, but a belief instilled from youth that the nation was eternal and duty sacred. These women avoided contact with guards, spoke only when necessary, and discouraged cooperation among others. Others, however, began to change slowly and quietly, not because they were persuaded or pressured, but because kindness disarms. The breaking of loyalty did not look like defiance. It looked like this: a woman asking a guard how to pronounce an English word, someone laughing softly at a joke exchanged during food distribution, groups singing in the evenings because they no longer feared punishment for joy. The change was subtle but unmistakable. They began to separate Germany from Nazism, a distinction that would have been impossible, unthinkable just months earlier. It was not guilt that drove this change. It was perspective. Seeing the enemy offer dignity meant recognizing that the world they had been taught to believe in was limited, controlled, incomplete. This realization was not relief. It was quiet pain, a mourning for faith. Over weeks and months, the women developed routines and relationships. They shared memories of home, braided each other's hair, mended clothes, learned English words slowly and deliberately, writing them on scraps of paper or repeating them by clotheslines. The camp library became a place of exchange. There were books in German, Goethe, Schiller, Heine. Reading familiar words in a foreign land reminded them of something they had forgotten. They had individual identities before the war. This is the essence of the climax. Not the disinfection, not the processing, not even the moment they realized they were safe. The pinnacle is the moment they return to themselves, when uniformity ceased to define them, when ideology lost its grip, when fear receded enough to reveal the person beneath. This transformation did not undo what had happened. It reached no conclusion, but made the next chapter possible. Because all wars end someday. And when the time came, these women had to return to the world, not as they were, but as what they had become. By late 1945, the war in Europe was over. The German state these women had served no longer existed. Adolf Hitler was dead. The Nazi leadership had collapsed or been captured. Germany was divided and occupied by the Allies. Cities like Dresden, Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne lay in ruins. Streets reduced to rubble and ash. Homes collapsed. Railways bent and abandoned. Millions were displaced. Hunger and uncertainty marked daily life. But in the Texas camps, life continued at its usual pace. For the German women imprisoned there, news of the wars arrived slowly. Some learned through Red Cross notices posted in common rooms. Others heard from newly arrived prisoners. Still others only grasped reality when trembling letters from home confirmed the inevitable. Germany had surrendered. They were now prisoners of a country no longer their active enemy in war. The conflict that had shaped their identity was gone. This realization was not celebrated. It brought silence and questions. What would happen to them? Would they be sent home? To what homes, if those homes no longer existed? The U.S. Army now faced the massive task of repatriation. Millions of German POWs remained in captivity worldwide, in the U.S., Canada, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and parts of Africa and the Middle East. Their repatriation would require time, organization, and political consensus. The process could not begin immediately, so the camps remained active. Work continued. Food was served. Guards stayed at their posts. But the atmosphere had changed. No one expected orders anymore. They were waiting for permission to return to a world that no longer resembled the one they remembered. For the first time in years, the women lived in a place free of violence. But peace brings its own challenges. Peace gives time to reflect, to remember, to feel. Some struggled with guilt, not for their actions, but for surviving. They had seen wounded soldiers carried through field hospitals. Some died in agony. Others whispered messages to families they would never see again. They remembered mothers clutching children in air raid shelters. They remembered trains packed with refugees fleeing collapsing fronts. Now they slept in beds under a roof, guarded by soldiers once described to them as barbarians. The contrast was stark, even painful. They were alive, fed, likely to return home. But to what home? Letters from Germany became windows into the scale of devastation. Some described cities razed beyond recognition. Some reported famine, so severe people traded family heirlooms for bread. Some said family homes had been burned, lost, or occupied. Others described silence, the absence of someone who had once been there. Each letter was a thread connecting them to a world that felt increasingly distant. The women in the camp read their letters aloud, holding trembling paper written in familiar handwriting. Sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. Some cried quietly. Others folded their letters and sat staring at the dusty ground. The war was over, but its aftermath was not. In the months that followed, the women began to redefine their self-image. Their uniforms had been replaced by civilian clothes, but the change was far deeper. They were no longer defined by the roles assigned to them in the wartime German state. They were no longer auxiliary workers, nurses, clerks, or staff in service to a ruined nation. They were simply people again, No enemies, no soldiers, no ideological symbols, just individuals. The slow return of personality is one of the most overlooked outcomes of captivity, even when it is humane, structured, and rooted in recognized dignity. And this internal recovery laid the foundation for what came next. Because sooner or later, the gates would open and the journey home would begin, not to the world they had left, but to the world that remained. Repatriation began gradually. The U.S. Army compiled release lists considering logistical capacity, transportation options, and diplomatic coordination. Some prisoners were released in early 1946. Others remained until 1947. A few stayed even longer, assisting with camp operations as the system was gradually dismantled. The German women in Texas were among those released in stagger groups. When their names were called, they gathered their belongings, clothes, identity documents, and sometimes a small bundle of personal items from the camp. But departure was not the triumphant return propaganda had promised. It was a journey into the unknown. The voyage back across the Atlantic was quieter than the trip to America. There was no fear of the unknown. Instead, there was tension, the certainty that life on the other side would not be as they remembered. The ships crossed the ocean slowly and docked in war-ravaged European ports. When the women disembarked, the silence was denser than gunfire. Germany was no longer a place of flags and speeches. Germany was a country of rubble, hunger, and the slow rebuilding of life. Cities had lost their streets amid debris. Trains ran irregularly, if at all. Families were scattered, expelled, or vanished entirely. Each woman's return was different, but many stories shared a common rhythm. Long walks through destroyed neighborhoods searching for landmarks. No homes. Instead, piles of broken bricks and twisted iron. Knocking on doors where no one answered. Faces transformed by grief, gaunt from rationing, silent from loss. Neighbors did not see the returning women as symbols of defeat. They saw them simply as people who had endured something incomprehensible. They were not celebrated. They were not condemned. They were just there, at first. The women spoke cautiously about their experiences in Texas. Some feared disbelief, others scorn. Why had they been fed while their families starved at home? Yet as conversations unfolded, a different reaction emerged. People listened, because the story of dignity in captivity seemed rare and fragile in an era defined by destruction. It did not erase suffering. It did not change losses. But it reminded people that even amid wartime collapse, humanity was still possible. Some of the women married. Some returned to work as nurses or office clerks. Some started families. Some emigrated. Some kept their memories to themselves, speaking of them only in old age. But none forgot the moment they realized the enemy they had been taught to fear was not the enemy they faced. Decades later, historians and interviewers sought these accounts. Oral history archives at universities, Red Cross correspondence records, and post-war memoirs revealed common themes. Shock at humane treatment, confusion at the collapse of propaganda machinery, relief followed by guilt, respect for the discipline and restraint of U.S. guards, the realization that identity can shift under new conditions. One former POW wrote in her memoirs, "We expected hatred. We received structure. We expected humiliation. We were granted privacy. We expected to lose our humanity. We were treated as if we still had it." That was her clearest memory, not the journey, not the fences, not the uncertainty, but the towel in her hands. A small gesture, an ordinary object, a profound message. For many years, few spoke openly about these experiences. Germany was in the midst of redefining its identity, and the past weighed heavily. There was no cultural space, yet for stories where the enemy showed mercy. Only as the women aged, as ideological urgency faded, as national narratives softened, as grandchildren began asking questions, did the stories emerge in full richness. They did not speak with nostalgia. They spoke with clarity and distinction. The war had been devastating. The regime they served had caused immense suffering. And yet, in the midst of that devastation, they had experienced something that revealed a fundamental truth. The capacity for human dignity does not depend on uniforms, nations, or victories. It depends on choices. And the Americans in these camps had chosen discipline, restraint, and respect. This is the quiet legacy of their internment. No drama, no battlefield victory, but the rediscovery of self after collapse. History often remembers wars through battles, leaders, strategies, and casualty figures. It measures conflicts in numbers, bombs dropped, divisions deployed, prisoners captured. But the story of the German women held in Texas reminds us that wars are also shaped by moments that never appear on military maps or in reports. A bar of soap, a clean towel, a closed door, small things whose significance far outweighed their physical size. These women were taken prisoner and expected brutality because they had been prepared for it. They had been told the enemy was monstrous, inhuman, savage. They believed it because the world they lived in left no room for nuance. But captivity forced them to confront reality. And in this case, reality was not hatred, it was calm, dignified serenity. This is not a story that excuses war or minimizes its consequences. It does not change the suffering caused or the devastation left behind. War remains a catastrophe, regardless of individual humanity found within it. This story reveals something else about human behavior in conflict. Even in times of destruction, people still choose how to treat one another. Guidelines set the framework, but implementation is up to each person. The guards could have ignored rules, acted with contempt, or punished without cause. Instead, many chose discipline. The women, stripped of identity and status, could have resisted fiercely. Instead, many chose cooperation. No one remained unchanged. No one returned to their former life. Yet some carried a tacit understanding. Enemies are not always what flags and governments claim. Dignity can be reclaimed through the simplest actions. And sometimes the deepest moments of war occur far from the battlefield. The German women who stood in Texas, clutching towels and awaiting a humiliation that never came, experienced this truth firsthand. Their story endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is human. And in the long memory of war, what matters most is humanity. And point 5S fast.